All right, well, welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. Really glad you're here tonight. And I wanted to bring you a really special episode tonight on the U.S. Constitution. This is a follow on episode to one we did 2 months ago about the Declaration of Independence. If you haven't seen that episode, it was a really great episode, put a lot of great research together for you about the drafting of the Declaration, about all the deliberations that went in around it. Thomas Jefferson and the other men that put it together. Jefferson sitting in a room for 17 days by himself, finishing the first draft, and then bringing that to the Continental Congress for revisions, amendments, and then, of course, ratification. So that was a really interesting topic. And so I felt like it was time to go to the second most important document in U.S. history, and that's the U.S. Constitution. If Jefferson was the penman and the inspiration behind the Declaration of Independence and the driving force behind it, writing those magical words that would resound through history, James Madison was the same thing for the U.S. Constitution. Of course, there were many more people involved in the drafting of the U.S. Constitution, but he really was the driving force behind it. He was the first delegate to arrive in Philadelphia. He was the last delegate to leave. And he organized and drove all the different committees and the entire group themselves, all 55 delegates, to come up with this brilliant and amazing new form of government that had never been tried before in human history. And the compromises that they came up with in the document itself to form this new government that still is thriving and flourishing today is really quite a testament to the men that were in that room and to the brilliant minds that contributed so much to making this a great document. Of course, it has been amended 27 times since the original draft in 1787, but again, it has been remarkably resilient over the years and over the centuries to being the backbone of our country, the backbone of our democracy, and the backbone of our republic, and really the driving force behind everything that's made the United States what it is, which is a very unique experiment in human history of a government that is by the people, for the people. So if you think about the history of documents in human history and look back, there's only a couple of documents you can really point to that really have this kind of consequence. Of course, you would point to the Bible, which is the most important book in human history. Of course, in the Muslim religion, it would be the Quran. You have books like the one we talked about last week in our episode about William the Conqueror, where we talked about the Doomsday Book, which was a book that he commissioned to essentially survey the entire country of England. And it became a remarkable book that still stands even today. Huge portions of England are mapped in that book. Then, of course, the most important document in American history is arguably the Declaration of Independence, because it obviously signaled to the world and to England that we were demanding our own independence after many grievances. And then this document, the most important governmental document in possibly human history, since the United States is the most powerful democracy that there ever has been. And it's because of this document we're going to talk about tonight, the U.S. Constitution. So we'll get into the history of it, what led up to it, the drafting of it over those many months in Philadelphia, and we'll talk about the ratification of it, which was difficult. It was definitely not easy, and there was some touch and go whether this document would ever really be approved by the states. And then we're going to go through a short video and talk about that on the other side. And then, of course, as always, we're going to go through the 25 interesting facts about the U.S. Constitution. And I've gotten together quite a few interesting tidbits that you probably don't know from your U.S. history class in high school about the Constitution. So let's go ahead and talk about the history of the U.S. Constitution and the lead up to it. The United States Constitution has served as the supreme law of the United States since taking effect in 1789. The document was written at the 1787 Philadelphia Convention and was ratified through a series of state conventions that were held in 1787 and 1788 in the 13 colonies. Since 1789, the Constitution has been amended 27 times. Particularly important amendments were the first 10 amendments, which, of course, were the United States Bill of Rights, and the 3 Reconstruction amendments that came after the Civil War. The Constitution grew out of efforts to reform the Articles of Confederation, which was an earlier document that formed the government right after we got our independence, but before this Constitution. That was an earlier Constitution that provided a loose alliance of states with a very weak central government. From May 1787 through September 1787, so essentially 6 months, delegates from 12 of the 13 states convened in Philadelphia, where they wrote this new Constitution together, again with James Madison as the lead. Two alternative plans were developed in the convention itself. The Nationalist majority, soon to be called the Federalists, put forth the Virginia Plan, which was drafted by Madison and his delegation. This was a consolidated government based on proportional representation among the states by population. The old patriots, later called anti-federalists, and this would be Jefferson and people like that, George Mason, they advocated the New Jersey Plan, a purely federal proposal based on providing each state with equal representation, no matter the size of the state. The Connecticut Compromise allowed for both plans to work together. Other controversies developed regarding slavery and a Bill of Rights in the original document. The drafted Constitution was submitted to the Congress of the Confederation in September of 1787 after 6 months of deliberation. That same month, it approved the forwarding of the Constitution as drafted to the states, each of which would hold their own ratifying convention at their state capitals. The Federalist Papers were published in newspapers while the states were deliberating and debating their ratification actions. And the Federalist Papers provided background and justification for the Constitution. They were primarily written to target New York State in their deliberations, but in the end, the Federalist Papers became so popular, written by, of course, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison, that they actually were published in newspapers all over the country and touched every single one of the states that was deliberating. Some states agreed to ratify the Constitution only if the amendments that were to become the Bill of Rights would be taken up immediately by the new government. In September 1788, the Congress of the new government In September 1788, the Congress of the Confederation certified that 11 states had ratified the new Constitution and chose dates for federal actions and the transition of the new Constitution to be on March 4th of 1789. The new government began on March 4th, 1789 on schedule, with 11 states assembled in New York City. North Carolina waited to ratify the Constitution until after the Bill of Rights was passed by the new Congress. And Rhode Island's ratification would only come after a threatened trade embargo. So Rhode Island were the only state that did not go to the Constitutional Convention and essentially boycotted voting for it until all the other states said they were going to embargo them, and then they went ahead and passed it. In 1791, the states ratified the Bill of Rights, which established protections for various civil liberties. The Bill of Rights initially only applied to the federal government, but following a process of incorporation, most protections of the Bill of Rights now apply to state governments as well. Further amendments to the Constitution have addressed federal relationships, election procedures, terms in office, expanding the electorate, financing the federal government, consumption of alcohol, and congressional pay. Between 1865 and 1870, the states ratified the Reconstruction Amendments, which abolished slavery, guaranteed equal protection of the law, and implemented prohibitions on the restriction of voter rights. The meaning of the Constitution is interpreted by judicial review in the federal courts and the Supreme Court. The original parchment copies of the U.S. Constitution are on display at the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. So that's just a little intro to the U.S. Constitution. Let's talk about the Declaration of Independence that preceded it. On June 4, 1776, a resolution was introduced into the Second Continental Congress declaring the union with Great Britain to be dissolved, proposing a formation of foreign alliances and suggesting the drafting of a plan of confederation to be submitted to the respective states. Independence was declared on July 4, 1776. The preparation of a planned confederation was postponed at that time. Although the Declaration was a statement of principles, it did not create a government or even a framework or how politics would be carried out. It was the Articles of Confederation that came later that provided the necessary structure to the new nation during and after the American Revolution. The Declaration, however, did set forth the ideals of natural rights and social contract that would help form the foundation of the constitutional government. The era of the Declaration of Independence is sometimes called the Continental Congress period. John Adams famously estimated as many as 1/3 of those resident in the original 13 colonies were patriots. Scholars such as Gordon Wood describe how many Americans were caught up in the revolutionary fervor and excitement of creating governments, societies, and a new nation on the face of the earth by rational choice, as Thomas Paine declared in his Common Sense. So that gives you a little kind of preview foundation of why the Declaration was so important in its foundation to the documents that were going to follow it. The First Continental Congress met from September 5th to October 26, 1774. It agreed that the states should impose an economic boycott on British trade and drew up a petition to King George III, pleading for redress of their grievances and repeal of the intolerable acts. It did not propose independence or a separate government for the states at that time. And again, this was 2 years before Declaration. In the Second Continental Congress, which convened May 10th of 1775 and functioned as a de facto national government at the outset of the Revolutionary War, beginning in 1777, the substantial powers assumed by Congress made the League of States as cohesive and strong as any similar sort of Republican confederation in human history. The process creating the United States was by the people in collectivity rather than by individual states. Because only 4 states had constitutions at the time, the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and 3 of those were provisional. The Supreme Court in Penello versus Doan's Administrators in 1795, and again in Wade versus Hilton in 1796, ruled on the federal government's powers prior to the adoption of the U.S. Constitution. It said that the Congress exercised powers derived from the people, expressly conferred through the medium of state conventions or legislatures, and once exercised, those powers were implicitly ratified by an acquiescence and obedience of the people. So you can see, even after the Constitution was passed and ratified, 10 years later, it was challenged twice in the Supreme Court and upheld as the supreme law of the land. So during the Confederation period, when the Articles of Confederation were approved and under effect, starting in 1777, sent to the states for ratification, it came into full force March 1st of 1781. So it took a full 3.5 years for the states to fully ratify and approve the Articles of Confederation. Over the previous 4 years, it had been used by Congress as a working document to administer the early United States government and win the Revolutionary War. Lasting successes under the Articles of Confederation included the Treaty of Paris with Britain and the Land Ordinance of 1785, where Congress promised settlers west of the Appalachian Mountains full citizenship and eventual statehood. Some historians characterize this period from 1781 to 1789 as weakness, dissension, and turmoil. Other scholars view the evidence as reflecting an underlying stability and prosperity. So there was really a debate whether that period under the Articles of Confederation really was weakness or whether it actually was just a development of the country as it was building. So other preludes to the Constitutional Convention during the Confederation period, one was the Mount Vernon Conference took place. This happened in March 1785 when delegates representing Maryland and Virginia met in Virginia to address navigational rights in the state's common waterways. On March 28, 1785, the group drew up a 13-point proposal to govern the 2 states' rights on the Potomac River and the Chesapeake Bay. Known as the Mount Vernon Compact, this agreement not only covered tidewater navigation, but also extended to issues such as toll duties and commerce regulations, fishing rights, and debt collection. Ratified by the legislatures of both states, the compact, which is still in force today, helped set a precedent for later meetings between the states and for discussions into areas of mutual concern. So you can see this Mount Vernon Conference, although it was just between Maryland and Virginia, and really just talking about water rights and fishing rights, was actually a really good model for what was going to be future conventions to come. So another convention that took place was the Annapolis Convention, formerly titled A Meeting of Commissioners to Remedy Defects of the Federal Government. It convened at George Mann's Tavern on September 11, 1786. And so this is the fall before the Constitutional Convention. Delegates from 5 states gathered to discuss ways to facilitate commerce between the states and establish standard rules and regulations. At the time, each state was largely independent from others, and the national government had no authority in these matters and was very weak. Appointed delegates from 4 states either arrived too late to participate or otherwise decided not to attend. Because so few states were present, delegates did not seem it advisable to proceed on the business of their mission. However, they did adopt a report calling for another convention in the future of all states to discuss possible improvements to their Articles of the Confederation. So again, you can see that the Mount Vernon Conference and then the Annapolis Convention, which only had about half the states there, were really good precursors and foundational items to the eventual Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. So let's talk about that Constitutional Convention. 12 state legislatures, other than Rhode Island, so Rhode Island being the only exception that did not send anybody, but the 12 state legislatures sent delegates to convene in Philadelphia in May of 1787. As I said before, James Madison was the first to arrive, and he started, as soon as people started showing up, started meeting with individuals from Virginia and Maryland and Pennsylvania. And while the resolution calling the convention specified that its purpose was to propose amendments to the articles, so that was their original purpose for being there. Once the delegates all arrived and assembled and started talking, it became very clear by mid-June, about a month later, that the convention would propose a completely new and fresh constitution with a fundamentally new design for government. George Washington arrived on time in May, Sunday the day before the scheduled opening. For the entire duration of the convention, Washington was a guest at the home of Robert Morris, Congress's financier for the American Revolution and a Pennsylvania delegate. Morris entertained the delegates lavishly. William Jackson, in 2 years to be president of the Society of Cincinnati, had been Morris's agent in England at the time, and he won election as a non-delegate to be a convention secretary. The convention was scheduled to open May 14th, but only Pennsylvania and Virginia delegations had showed up at that point. The convention was postponed until a quorum of 7 states gathered on Friday, the 25th of May. George Washington was elected the convention president and chancellor. George Wythe was chosen chair of the Rules Committee. The rules of the convention were published the following Monday, so they basically spent all weekend talking and revising the rules and publishing them so they could get them ready for the next week. Nathaniel Gorham from Massachusetts was elected chair of the Committee of the Whole. These were the same delegates in the same room, but they could use informal rules for their interconnected provisions in the draft articles to be made, remade, and reconnected as the order of business proceeded. The convention officials and adopted procedures were in place before the arrival of nationalist opponents, such as John Lansing from New York and Luther Martin from Maryland. By the end of May, the stage was set for this convention. The Constitutional Convention voted to keep the debate secret so that the delegates could speak freely, negotiate, bargain, compromise, and change as much as they wanted to behind closed doors. Yet the proposed Constitution, as reported from the convention, was an innovation, the most dismissive epithet a politician could use to condemn any new proposal. It promised a fundamental change of the old Confederation into a new, consolidated, yet federal government. The accepted secrecy of usual affairs conducted in regular order did not apply. It became a major issue in the very public debates leading up to the crowd-filled ratification conventions later in the states. Despite the public outcry that was going on against secrecy, the delegates continued in positions of public trust. State legislatures chose 10 convention delegates of their 33 total for their constitutional convention that September. Every few days, new delegates would arrive, happily noted in Madison's journal He actually kept attendance of all the delegates who would arrive and go. But as the convention went on, individual delegates coming and goings meant a state's vote could change with the change of delegate composition. The volatility added to the inherent difficulties of actually passing a constitution, making for an ever-present danger that the convention might dissolve, the entire project might be abandoned. Although 12 states sent delegations, there were never more than 11 represented in floor debates at any time. Sometimes there were fewer. State delegations absented themselves at votes different times of the day. There was no minimum for a state delegation one would do. Daily sessions would have 30 members present. Members came and went on public and personal business. The Congress of the Confederation was meeting at the same time, so members would absent themselves to New York City on congressional business for days and weeks at a time and then come back. But the work before them was continuous, even if attendance was not. The convention resolved itself into a committee of the whole and could remain so for days. It was informal. Votes would be taken and retaken. Positions could change without prejudice in judgment. And importantly, no formal quorum call was required. The Nationalists were resolute. As Madison put it, the situation was too serious for despair. They used the same State House, later named Independence Hall, as was used for the Declaration signers. The building set back from the street was still dignified, but the shaky people were gone. When they adjourned each day, they lived in nearby lodgings as guests, roomers, or renters. They ate supper with each other in town and taverns and talked and debated, often talking about what issues they were going to talk about in the next day's meetings. Delegates reporting to the convention presented their credentials to the Secretary Major William Jackson of South Carolina. The state legislatures of the day used these occasions to say why they were sending representatives abroad. New York thus publicly enjoined its members to pursue all possible alterations and provisions for the good government and preservation of the Union. New Hampshire called for timely measures to enlarge the powers of Congress. Virginia stressed the necessity of extending the revision of the federal system to all of its defects. Conversely, Delaware categorically forbade an alteration of the Article 1 vote per state provision in the Article of Confederation. The convention would have a great deal of work to do to reconcile the many expectations of the chamber and the many differences in opinion of the states. On May 29th, Edmund Randolph of Virginia proposed the Virginia Plan, which unofficially set the agenda for the convention. It was weighted towards the interests of the larger, more populous states. The intent was to meet the purposes set out in the Articles of Confederation: common defense, security of liberty, and general welfare of the entire country. The Virginia Plan was national. Authority flowed from the people. If the people will ratify them, changes for better Republican government and national union should be proposed and would be passed. Much of the Virginia Plan was adopted. All the powers in the Articles transferred to the new government. Congress has two houses. The House appointed by population. It can enact laws affecting more than one state, and Congress can override a veto. The president can enforce the law. The Supreme Court and interior courts rule on international U.S. and state law. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and all state officers swear to uphold the Constitution. Every state is a republic, and new states can be admitted. The Congress of the Confederation continued until the new system started. Amendments are possible without Congress. The convention recommendations went to Congress, from them to the states. State legislatures set the election rules for ratification conventions, and the people expressly chose representatives to consider and decide about the Constitution and its passage. On June 15th, some weeks later, William Paterson of New Jersey proposed the convention's minority New Jersey Plan. It was weighted towards the interests of the smaller, less populous states. The intent was to preserve the states from a plan to destroy or annihilate them economically. The New Jersey Plan was purely federal. Authority flowed from the states. Gradual change would come from the states And if the articles could not be amended, then advocates argued that should be the report from the convention to the states. Although the New Jersey plan only survived 3 days as a proposal, it served as an important alternative to the Virginia plan. Substantial elements of the New Jersey plan were eventually adopted. The articles were revised, corrected, and enlarged for good government and preservation of the Union. The Senate is elected by the states at first by state legislatures. Congress passes acts for revenue collected directly in the states, and the ruling of the state courts are reviewed by the U.S. Supreme Court. State appointment for taxes failed, but the House is appointed by population count of inhabitants and 3/5 of others originally. States can be added to the Union. Presidents appoint federal judges. Treaties entered into Congress are the supreme law of the land. All state judiciaries are bound to enforce treaties, state laws notwithstanding. The president can raise an army to enforce treaties in any state. States treat a violation of law by another state as though it happened there. So these are all the things that came out of the New Jersey plan. So you can see the convention itself had a little bit of a problem. They had a majority of folks who wanted the Virginia plan, but there was a minority of people that wanted the New Jersey plan. So they had to come up with a compromise. There was also a big debate over slavery, which was very controversial and too controversial to be solved at this convention, or they would not have gotten anything passed. But it was at the center stage of the debate many, many times during the months. On June 7th, regarding who would vote for Congress, June 11th in debate over how to proportion relative seating in the House, and on August 22nd relating to commerce and the future wealth of the nation. Once the convention looked at how to proportion the House representation, tempers among several delegates exploded over slavery. When the convention progressed beyond the personal attacks, it adopted the existing federal ratio for taxing states by 3/5 of slaves held. On August 6th, the Committee of Detail reported its proposed revisions to the Randolph Plan. Again, the question of slavery came up, and again, the question was met with attacks and outrage. Over the next 2 weeks, delegates wove a web of mutual compromises relating to commerce and trade, East and West, slaveholding and free. The transfer of power to regulate slave trade from states to central government could happen in 20 years, but only then. Later generations could try out their own answers. The delegates were trying to make a government that would last that long. Migration of the free or importation of indentures and slaves could continue by states, defining slaves as persons, not property. Long-term power would change by population as counted every 10 years. So that's essentially the foundation of the census. Apportionment in the House would not be by wealth, it would be by the people. So then came the Great Connecticut Compromise. Roger Sherman of Connecticut, although something of a political broker in Connecticut, proved to be a pivotal, although unlikely, leader at the convention. On June 11th, he proposed the first version of the convention's Great Compromise. It was like the proposal he made in the 1776 Continental Congress. Representation in Congress should be both by states and by population. This was the Great Compromise. There, he was voted down by small states in favor of all states being equal, one vote only. So that happened in 1776. Now, 11 years later, in 1787, he wanted to balance all the big state victories for population apportionment. He proposed that in the second Senate branch of the legislature, each state would be equal, one vote and no more. The motion for equal state representation in the Senate failed, 6 against, 5 for. After these defeats, the delegates also called themselves the Old Patriots of 1776 and the Men of Original Principles, organized a caucus in the convention. William Patterson spoke for them, introducing his New Jersey plan. Roger Sherman, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was with them. Supporters explained that it was sustained sovereignty of the states, where Edmund Randolph from Virginia had a Virginia plan that erased it. Then on June 25th, the original principles men finally won a vote. The Senate would be chosen by the state legislatures, not the people, passed 9 for and 2 against. The basis of representation for both the House and the Senate resurfaced. Sherman tried a second time to get this idea for a House on the basis of population and a Senate on the equal basis. The big states got their population House win, and the little states got their Senate win. The majority adjourned before the determination was taken in the House. Luther Martin insisted that he would rather divide the Union into regional governments than submit to a consolidated government under the Randolph Plan. Sherman's proposal came up again for a third time from Oliver Ellsworth from Connecticut. In the Senate, the states would have equal representation. Advocates said that it could not be agreed to. The Union would fall apart somehow. Big states would not be trusted. The small states could confederate with a foreign power, showing more good faith. If delegates could not unite behind this here one day, the states could be united by some foreign sword. On the question of equal state representation, the convention adjourned in the same way again before determination was taken in the House. On July 16th, Sherman's great compromise prevailed finally on its fifth try. Every state was to have equal numbers in the United States Senate. Washington ruled it passed by the vote of 5 yes, 4 no, and 1 divided. It was not that the 5 states constituted a majority of 12, but to keep the business moving forward, Washington relied on precedent established earlier in the convention that only a majority of states voting was required. The first Committee on Representation and the Connecticut Compromise became the turning point of the convention. While some of the large state delegations discussed leaving the convention, none did. Debate over the next 10 days developed an agreed general outline for the U.S. Constitution. Small states readily yielded on many questions. Following the compromise, most remaining delegates, large state and small state, felt safe enough to chance the new plan. So as you can see, it really is an amazing thing that this came to pass. There were so many disagreements on the floor between the big states and small states. They had different agendas. The fact that they finally got to a compromise and that Washington was able to declare that it had passed was a huge thing in the drafting of this document. In terms of limitation of governments in the Constitution during the ratification, sovereignty was no longer to be theoretically indivisible. With a wide variety of specific powers among different branches of national governments and 13 Republican state governments, now each of the portions of powers delegated to one or the other is as sovereign with regard to its proper objects. There are some powers that remain behind, but essentially what they had done is they had divvied up power enough among the federal government and the states that they felt comfortable that there was good checks and balances throughout the Constitution. So after nearly 4 months of debate, on September 8th, 1787, the final text of the U.S. Constitution was set down and revised, and an original copy of the document was engrossed by Jacob Challis, who was the scriber of the entire Constitution. The effort consisted of copying the text, prelude, articles, and endorsement on 4 sheets of vellum parchment made from treated animal skin and measuring approximately 28 inches by 23 inches on each page. Probably with a goose quill, Challis engrossed the entire document except for a list of states at the end of the document, which are in Alexander Hamilton's handwriting and affixed later. On September 17, 1787, following a speech given by Benjamin Franklin, 39 delegates endorsed and submitted the Constitution to the Congress of the Confederation. In terms of ratification of the Constitution, Massachusetts' Rufus King assessed the convention as a creature of the states, independent of the Congress of the Confederation, submitting its proposal to that Congress only to satisfy forms. Though amendments were debated, they were all defeated. On September 28, 1787, the Congress of the Confederation resolved unanimously to transmit the Constitution to state legislatures for submitting to a ratification convention. According to the constitutional procedure, several states enlarged the numbers qualified just for electing ratification delegates purposes. In doing so, they went beyond the Constitution's provision for the most voters of the state legislature. Delaware, on December 7, 1787, became the first state to ratify the new Constitution, with its vote being unanimous. Pennsylvania ratified on December 12, 5 days later, by a vote of 46 to 23. New Jersey ratified on December 19th, 1787, and Georgia on January 2nd, 1788, both unanimously. The requirement of ratification by 9 states set by the Article 7 of the Constitution was met when New Hampshire voted to ratify June 21st of 1788. So now you had the full 9 states you needed, and it was approved. In New York, fully 2/3 of the convention delegates were at first opposed to the Constitution. Hamilton led the Federalist campaign, which included the fast-paced appearance of the Federalist Papers in New York papers, of which he wrote about 2/3 of them. An attempt to attach conditions to ratification almost succeeded, but on July 26, 1788, New York finally ratified with a recommendation that a Bill of Rights be appended to the Constitution in the future. The vote was close. You had yeas 30, nays 27. Due largely to Hamilton's forensic abilities and his reaching a few key compromises with moderate anti-federalists, he was able to get it approved. Following Massachusetts' lead, the Federalist minorities in both Virginia and New York were able to obtain ratification in convention by linking ratification to recommended amendments. A minority of Constitution critics continued to oppose the Constitution. Maryland's Luther Martin argued that the Federal Convention had exceeded its authority, and he still called for amending the Articles. Article 13 of the Articles of Confederation stated the Union created under Articles were perpetual, and that any alteration must be agreed to by the Congress of the United States. However, the unanimity required under the Articles made all attempts at reform impossible. Martin's allies, such as New York's John Lansing Jr., dropped moves to obstruct the convention's progress. On September 13, 1788, the Congress of the Confederation certified that the new Constitution had been ratified by more than enough states for it to go into effect. Congress fixed the city of New York as the temporary seat of the new government and set the dates of the election of representatives and presidential electors. It also set the date for operations to begin under the new government. This occurred on March 4th, 1789, when the first Congress convened. So you can see the lead up to the Constitution, all the different documents it took to get there, all the debates, all the disagreements, the compromises, working with big states, working with small states, rural states, all the different agendas that these men had across the board, trying to represent their constituencies, in some cases with some fairly selfish reasons. They finally got there. It took them several years to get there, but they got to a new government, a new constitution, a stronger federal government, checks and balances included to make sure the states continue to have their powers, and that each of the federal agencies and branches would balance out each other. So they finally got to where they wanted to be. So that's a little bit of history of the U.S. Constitution and its ratification and drafting in Philadelphia. All right, well, let's go ahead and take a look at the video, and we'll come back and talk about it on the other side.
The story of the Constitutional Convention begins in the spring of 1787 with America's most overprepared politician, James Madison. In the past months, every state, except Rhode Island, had decided to hold what we today call a Constitutional Convention, although at the time they called it the Federal Convention or just the Philadelphia Convention. James Madison arrived in Philadelphia a week early, since he had some scheming to do. See, most of the delegates that would be attending the convention assumed that they were going to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. In fact, the Confederation Congress had made it clear that the sole and express purpose of the Federal Convention would be to propose revisions to the current articles. Madison wanted to sway some key voices into doing the exact opposite of what the Congress asked them to do. He wanted to propose a new Constitution of the United States of America. The way Madison saw it, there were three kinds of delegates that would be arriving. Federalists, like himself, that wanted a new constitution, moderate reformers that wanted amendments to the Articles of Confederation in varying degrees, and conservative anti-federalists opposing reform. Madison got his hands on a list of every state delegation that was going to attend the convention, and categorized each attendee into one of these boxes. What he found was interesting. A lot of the delegates had been officers in the Continental Army, and even more had served in the federal government in one way or another. Both of these groups had first-hand experience into how broken the Articles of Confederation were. chances are they'd at least hear Madison out. Also, apparently there were going to be like so many Williams there. Like, would it have killed him to send more interesting names like Gunning Bedford Jr. or Daniel of St. Thomas Jennifer? Madison spent some of his extra time in Philly letting other members of the Virginia delegation in on his plan. Two in particular needed some convincing: George Mason and Edmund Randolph. Both recognized that a lot of reform was needed if America was going to succeed, but they thought that what Madison was proposing went too far. Madison had an ace up his sleeve, though. He had been working the past months to convince this guy named George Washington to attend the convention, while letting him in on his plan. Washington was really supportive of Madison, so Mason and Randolph kinda had to be too. Politicians didn't get very far in Virginia by disagreeing with old George. These early meetings were also attended by two Pennsylvanians, Gouverneur Morris and James Wilson, both very supportive Federalists. What the Virginia and Pennsylvania delegations worked on before the convention became known as the Virginia Plan. It proposed a new three-branch government where the legislative, executive, and judiciary would all share federal power. The legislature would be bicameral, having an upper and a lower house. Both houses would have seats proportional to the population of the states. It seems pretty normal today because a lot of this stuff is the system we have today, but at the time it was pretty radical stuff. In the Confederation Congress, each state received one vote no matter how many people were in that state. According to the Virginia Plan, the lower house would also be elected directly by the people, unlike Confederation congressmen, which were chosen by the state legislatures. Most alarmingly to the states' rights crowd, the federal government's laws would take precedence over state laws where they overlapped. On May 25th, enough delegates had shown up to officially begin the convention. Washington was unanimously elected as the presiding officer, surprise surprise, and it adopted a rule of secrecy during proceedings. The delegates wanted to have a reasonable discussion where they could voice their concerns, debate, and change their minds without any fear from the press or their constituencies. A few days after the convention began, the Federalists set their plan in motion. Randolph presented the Virginia Plan to the convention, and Gouverneur Morris asked the delegates to take it into debate. The Federalists had shifted the debate from "should we adopt a new government" to "what is the new government going to look like?" A delegate from South Carolina named Charles Pinckney also had some ideas about what to add to the Articles of Confederation. His points became known as the Pinckney Plan, and Madison and a lot of other Federalists decided that he was bringing up some really good points. Some of what he brought up got absorbed into the Virginia Plan, like detailing the structure of the executive branch and outlining a better way to propose amendments. Despite winning the early victory and Washington's support, they began to face opposition. Small states and moderate reformers weren't thrilled with the Virginia Plan, and the debates began to tweak and propose changes to Madison's vision. They proposed the New Jersey Plan, which kept states equally represented in Congress. They would also keep Congress to just one house, just like the Confederation Congress. They also wanted to keep the powers of the federal government limited, although they were prepared to make it more powerful than the current one. This was great for small states and great for moderates, since the plan was presented as amendments to the Articles of Confederation. The delegates split over predictable lines, small states supporting the New Jersey Plan and large states supporting the Virginia Plan. New York, which, apart from Alexander Hamilton, had sent two extremely conservative anti-federalists, supported the New Jersey Plan. Speaking of Hamilton, he was being uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, on June 18th, he gave his first speech, and it was a doozy. Hamilton proposed that both plans on the table put too much faith in the people, or the mob as he referred to them. The mob needed to be checked by a powerful central government, or it would destroy everything that they had fought for in the Revolution. Senators should serve life terms on good behavior, while the House should be elected periodically. The executive should also serve for life unless impeached. Then Hamilton said a no-no word. He referred to this executive as a monarch. The speech was so far removed from what most delegates wanted that it was largely ignored by everyone else. His plan was politely put on the back burner, and the debate got back to the two main plans on the table. The speech was leaked to the press, and he'd have accusations of being a closet monarchist for years to come. My favorite description of this speech was that it was brilliant, courageous, and completely daft. The speech did have one important achievement. It made Madison's plan look moderate by comparison. Suddenly, Madison was arguing for a middle ground. Some say this is exactly what Hamilton had in mind all along, but Hamilton's whole shtick was being a loose cannon, so who knows. After Hamilton's diversion, the stalemate continued for weeks. Benjamin Franklin, who was the most respected delegate after Washington, proposed that they say a prayer for unity. I only bring this up because Franklin was a deist, someone who believed that God did not intervene in human affairs. If even he was asking for divine intervention, things were desperate. On July 6th, the New York delegation, apart from Hamilton, packed up and left. If they could have had it their way, they would have kept the Articles of Confederation almost exactly as they were. Now, thanks to Madison, they had to choose between two new forms of government that would hurt the economic boom that New York was going through. Hamilton kept on attending, but a state needed two people to vote on measures, so he was pretty powerless. His attendance was on and off for the rest of the convention. Now, Rhode Island and New York were both out. Only 11 states remained, and the Delaware delegation threatened to leave too if the small states were not granted some concessions. They needed a compromise. Roger Sherman and the delegation from Connecticut worked with Benjamin Franklin to put forward a compromise, where the lower house of the legislature would be proportional to the population of each state, but the upper house would be represented by the same number of senators, no matter how populous the state. Splitting the houses of Congress helped ease the small and large state divide, but there was another split that Madison was even more worried about. There was this understanding among the delegates that the more slavery was brought up, the likelier the slave states were to walk out. Early opponents to slavery knew that pushing for emancipation at the convention would guarantee that the Constitution would fail. The slave states argued that their slaves should count towards their overall population, giving them more congressmen in the House. Gouverneur Morris was one of the few delegates that had no issue bad-mouthing slavery, despite his support for the Constitution. He had risen more times to speak than any other person there, despite having a wooden leg. He also had no filter. He said that counting slaves towards the amount of congressmen a state was allowed to send was absurd. He went on to call slavery a curse, something that was morally abhorrent and completely antithetical to everything America should stand for. Unfortunately, the other delegates would not back him up, and he did not press the issue, fearing that the South would walk out. Instead, the federal ratio, or what's today known as the 3/5 Compromise, was added to the Connecticut Compromise. The population of 5 black slaves would be equal to 3 free white men when apportioning the House. With this, the Connecticut Compromise passed, and the debates could continue. The convention moved on to discussing the executive branch. There were a few competing ideas of what the branch should look like. Ben Franklin wanted an executive council, which Pennsylvania and a few other states had at the time. Elbridge Gerry wanted 3 executives, one from the South, one from the Mid-Atlantic, and one from New England to share power and keep each region represented in the government. Washington wanted just one person, who would serve one 7-year term, then be prohibited from serving in the office ever again. Eventually, the delegates agreed on one president with an unlimited amount of 4-year terms. How the president would be chosen was a complex question. The delegates, like Hamilton, were afraid of the mob, so they couldn't let the president be directly elected. Others wanted the legislature to elect the president, but this seemed a little too much like Parliament, and it violated the separation of powers that they were going for. Instead, they came up with the now infamous Electoral College. The idea was to keep the president insulated from the mob by a layer of electors chosen by the state assemblies. I'm not going to go into the inner workings and criticisms of the Electoral College here, but it's been debated ad nauseum on the internet. I'm sure you can find a place to explain it. One thing I will add is that since the 3/5 Compromise was adopted, slave population would inflate the Electoral College vote count of slave states, so the Electoral College was really a no-brainer for any state with a growing slave population. Later, when discussing the powers of Congress, slavery came up yet again. The southern states were afraid of falling behind the mercantile North, so they wanted any bill involving trade to require a supermajority in Congress. This was a non-starter for the Federalists. One of the main reasons the current government wasn't working was that a supermajority was needed to do anything. Instead, they extended an offer to Georgia and South Carolina. In exchange for allowing trade laws to pass with a simple majority, the Constitution would guarantee that no amendment or law could be passed that could end the slave trade for 20 years. George Mason hated both halves of this deal. He argued that a supermajority was the only way to keep the South from falling behind the North economically. He also hated slavery, especially the slave trade, despite owning 300 slaves himself. A lot of slave owners at the time, like Mason, Madison, Washington, and Jefferson, all acknowledged that slavery was evil, but they either refused to do anything about it or saw it as a necessary compromise to keep the Constitution alive. Mason went on in his speech to predict that the South's reliance on slavery would slow its economic growth, allowing the country to be dominated by the northern free states. He knew that slavery was evil, and he and educated Southerners knew that it would be a long-term burden on their states. But slavery was in the process of embedding itself in Southern society, and not many were willing to stop it. Finally, after 4 months of deliberation, debate, and compromise, their ideas were ready to be put down on paper. As the two most vocal supporters of the new government at the convention, Madison and Morris were tasked with writing the actual document. When they completed the document, the preamble read, "We the people of the states of," and listed all the 13 states by name, similar to how the Articles of Confederation began. Morris thought that instead of naming each state, they should just be replaced with the United States. It's a subtle change, but it reflected the fact that the new government would be representing the people of the country as a whole, not just the states that made up the Union. Madison agreed. One notable thing that the delegates left out was a Bill of Rights. Some states had added one to their state constitutions, but seeing the can of worms that debating one would cause, they left it out. The final article of the Constitution, Article 7, stated that the Constitution would go into effect after it was ratified by 9 state conventions. After that, it would become the government of those 9 states. Everything up to that point occupied a gray area of legality where the convention delegates were playing fast and loose with the Articles of Confederation, but this one was in blatant violation of Article 13. Once you were in the Confederation, you could not leave or form separate alliances with other states. The only way to change this or leave was a unanimous amendment to the Articles. Now, a few dozen people in Philly had just decided that if the 9 states agreed, they could leave. As the convention drew to a close, George Mason decided that the Constitution went too far in its federal powers, and didn't do enough to protect Southern interests. He wrote a list of objections and tried to find anti-federalist allies to oppose the signing of the document. But by this point, most of the delegates had gotten some compromise out of the debates. The anti-federalists in the New York delegation had already left, and the anti-federalists in the Maryland delegation had gone home at the beginning of September. But he still wasn't the only critic of the Constitution that stayed. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts had several objections that he shared with Mason, plus Madison and Morris had not included a Bill of Rights. How else was the government supposed to have checks on its own power? Mason was the guy that had written Virginia's Declaration of Rights, and he was adamant that it was needed in a document that would be as powerful as the Constitution. Edmund Randolph also had objections. He had been one of the earliest supporters of the convention, and he had pushed Washington to attend, but now things seemed to be getting out of control. He proposed that the states should be able to propose amendments at their state ratifying conventions, and send them back to another constitutional convention. Gerry saw this as a chance to get a federal Bill of Rights, and he seconded the motion. Charles Pinckney of South Carolina rose to address the proposal. Giving every state the opportunity to propose their own amendments would lead to 13 sets of conflicting amendments. It would kill the Constitution. Gerry attempted to rebut Pinckney, but he ended up shooting himself in the foot. He basically said that before the Constitution was ratified, amendments needed to be added that would get rid of Congress's power to tax and regulate trade, as well as the Three-Fifths Compromise. Regulating taxation and trade was like the core reason that they were even at the convention. And the Three-Fifths Compromise, if any of the southern states were going to vote for the Constitution, that had to stay in. Gerry had successfully talked potential allies out of voicing their concerns. The state delegations unanimously voted down Randolph's proposal to allow amendments during the state conventions. They were not the only people unhappy with the Constitution. Madison, Hamilton, and Washington all thought that they had actually conceded too much, but there was a general consensus that this Constitution was the only alternative to the dissolution of the Union. Before the Constitution was signed, Ben Franklin gave a speech that captured how the room was feeling. This wasn't the document that he would have made if he was the one writing it, but it was the best that they could do. He wasn't totally on board with it, but the Constitution would enjoy his full support, and he hoped that the other delegates would support it too. On September 17th, the Constitution was voted on and signed by the state delegations. All 11 states present voted to endorse the Constitution. Of the 42 delegates present, all but 3 signed the document: Edmund Randolph and George Mason of Virginia, and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. And a lot of times, this is where the story will end. The Constitutional Convention succeeded, and America lived happily ever after. But the Constitution wasn't a done deal yet. 9 out of 13 states still had to ratify it, and in September of 1787, that wasn't a sure thing. The Constitution was sent to the Confederation Congress, and the battle for ratification began.
So as you can see, there's just so many things to talk about coming out of that video. The first one being, you saw Madison arrive a week ahead of time. He was very excited. He was eager to start talking to delegations as they started to arrive. He started working immediately with the Virginia delegation and the Pennsylvania delegation, and started drafting some ideas and started getting them to agree that what they didn't want to do was just amend the Articles of Confederation, but in fact, they wanted to spring a surprise agenda on the convention itself, and that is they wanted to draft an entirely new constitution for a completely new government that was much stronger than previously had been put together in the Articles of Convention. And so this was a surprise to many who had arrived shortly after Madison, but this was his plan all along. He had told George Washington about it. He had some allies in the Pennsylvania delegation, and essentially that first week before everybody arrived, they came up with what they called the Virginia Plan, which was very advantageous to the larger states. As you can see, as the convention progressed, there was a new plan that was drafted to be much more favorable to the smaller states, and that was the New Jersey Plan. And so you immediately, several weeks into the convention, had a big problem. You had these two plans that were diametrically opposed, didn't look like they could really work with each other. And you had Charles Pinckney from South Carolina propose some amendments that were actually absorbed into the Virginia Plan. And then you had Alexander Hamilton come forward with a very radical plan that would be even more federalist than the Virginia Plan. So you had all kinds of things going on and all kinds of debate points that had to be made. And then finally, as you saw, the Connecticut Plan came forward, was sitting in the middle between the two competing plans, and they found a way over those last couple of months to piece together this government and piece together a document that they could all agree to, that had elements of the Virginia Plan, elements of the Pinckney Plan, and elements of the New Jersey Plan, and made all the different constituencies and agendas all happy so they can move forward and approve the document and get it on its way towards ratification. You can see all the many intricacies, all the different players, the politicians, people with different agendas, people with different constituencies at home. You had, of course, Rhode Island didn't even show up and didn't approve the plan until they had an embargo threatened against them. You had states like New York and Virginia that approved it very, very late after everybody else had already approved it. So a lot of things were going on at this time, and politically it was a very difficult process. The fact that these founders were able to come together, by the way, as you noticed, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were both not there. John Adams was actually in England at the time representing the United States, and Thomas Jefferson was in Paris, France, representing the United States in the French government. So you had two of your more leading voices of the original founders who weren't part of this process. You also saw a really key moment when the convention was about to fall apart and many of the delegates were about to go home and essentially crush the whole purpose of the convention itself. This was a couple months into the process. Benjamin Franklin stood up and gave a rousing speech, and it ended with a very long prayer to the divine, to God, essentially, to help us and to help us through this process, help bring us together as a country and find a way towards a compromise that would work. And that speech was very motivational and helped break the logjam towards the Connecticut Plan, which is what ended up being adopted. So lots of really interesting things there. As you can see, the U.S. Constitution still holding today with its 27 amendments. They built it so that it was difficult to amend, but possible to amend. But they wanted it to be the supreme law of the land. And as you see, it did become that, even through a difficult process. So really fascinating, interesting stuff there. You should take some time to read the actual U.S. Constitution itself. It is not that long. It's only 4 pages, and it will really guide you and make you understand intimately our government as it is. So anyway, that's a little bit about the video. Let's go ahead and take a look at the 25 interesting facts about the U.S. Constitution. Number one, the U.S. Constitution is brief in comparison. The U.S. Constitution has 4,400 words. It is the oldest and shortest written constitution of any major government in the world. Thomas Jefferson did not sign the U.S. Constitution. He was in France during the convention, where he served as the U.S. minister. John Adams was serving as U.S. minister to Great Britain during the Constitutional Convention and also did not attend or sign the document. You can see a great picture there of the delegates all working together, greeting each other and debating the Constitution itself. And there's a picture of George Washington, who, of course, was named the president of this Constitutional Convention. Number two, James Madison fought and won an oratory duel with Patrick Henry regarding the Constitution. You see a picture of him there debating the adoption of the U.S. Constitution in his home state of Virginia. That's in the Virginia legislature, which was in Richmond at the time. Throughout their home state of Virginia, Patrick Henry was renowned as a public speaking heavyweight who wooed crowds wherever he went. Thomas Jefferson declared that the booming debater spoke as Homer wrote. Madison, in contrast, had a very quiet voice and little talent for theatrics. In 1788, a ratifying convention was held in Richmond to determine if Virginia would grant her approval to the Constitution Madison had helped engineer. Patrick Henry staunchly opposed this document and loudly decried it for leaning towards monarchy. Madison offered concise, well-articulated rebuttals to every argument, and Virginia's representatives voted 89 to 79 in favor of ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So this really was a big deal. He essentially went up against one of the 2 or 3 best speakers in the entire country at the time, Patrick Henry, and was able to win this debate with just reasoned arguments about why this Constitution was important to adopt and important to the future of the United States itself. Number 3, the U.S. Constitution was actually penned by a local Pennsylvania man. The Constitution was penned by Jacob Shallis, a Pennsylvania General Assembly clerk, for $30, which was his salary during this time, which today would be a little over $1,000. He wrote down the words of James Madison and Gouverneur Morris for the first draft, and then added many amendments through the months of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Of the spelling errors in the Constitution, Pennsylvania, with one N above the signers' names, is probably the most glaring. When it came time for the Constitution to be signed, Alexander Hamilton helped out by writing the name of the respective states represented by the signatories. Pennsylvania, Hamilton wrote beside Benjamin Franklin's name, omitting the second N. No one corrected it then, and no one has corrected it since. So you can see the original document that's in the National Archives today has Pennsylvania misspelled by Alexander Hamilton. Number 4, an original copy of the U.S. Constitution is on display at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. You can see a picture of it there on the bottom left, and you see it's under heavy guard at all times. Since 1952, the Constitution has been on display in the National Archives building in D.C. Currently, all 4 pages are displayed behind protective glass, framed with titanium and protected by 24-hour guards. To preserve the parchment's quality, the cases contain argon gas and are kept at 67 degrees Fahrenheit with a relative humidity of 40%. Constitution Day is celebrated on September 17th, which is the anniversary of the day the framers signed the document at the convention. So pretty interesting. If many of you didn't know about Constitution Day, there you go. And definitely, if you get a chance to go to D.C., make some time to go to see this Constitution in all 4 pages at the National Archives. It's really worth going and visiting it and taking a look at it. Number 5, James Madison arrived to the Constitutional Convention first, as we mentioned. He was the father of the Constitution, and he was the first to arrive in Philadelphia for the convention a full week before other delegates. He arrived in early May, starting to work on a blueprint for the new Constitution and meeting delegates of Virginia and Pennsylvania to get their feedback on what he had put on paper to that point. Governor Morris was largely responsible for the wording of the Constitution, although there was a committee of style that was formed in September 1787 to do the final wording edit. You can see Governor Morris there on the right, and then on the top left is Madison standing up with Benjamin Franklin and a couple of the other delegates on his left. Number 6, the lack of Bill of Rights almost killed the Constitution project. Of the 42 delegates who attended most of the meetings, 39 actually signed the Constitution. Edmund Randolph and George Mason of Virginia and Eldridge Berry of Massachusetts refused to sign at the end of the convention, due in part to the lack of a Bill of Rights, which they had in their state constitutions. When it came time for the states to ratify the Constitution, the lack of a Bill of Rights was a primary sticking point and also almost derailed the document's passage. On March 24, 1788, a popular election was held in Rhode Island to determine the ratification status of the new Constitution. The vote was 237 in favor and 2945 opposed. So as you can see, Rhode Island was heavily opposed to this document ever being approved. And as you heard earlier in the video, it took a long time. As you heard earlier in my remarks at the beginning of the program, it took a long time for Rhode Island to be the last to actually approve it. Number 7, George Mason drafted the Virginia Constitution with Madison, which helped frame the later U.S. Constitution. You see a picture there of George Mason on the top right, and a copy of the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was largely one of the major models for the U.S. Constitution. Mason played key roles in writing the Constitution of Virginia and in formulation of the Declaration of Rights for Virginia, which became the model for the Bill of Rights. Some of the language used in the U.S. Constitution is same or similar to the language Mason had used before in Virginia, such as high crimes and misdemeanors and aid and comfort of enemies. After the Constitution was adopted, Mason worked with others to fashion a set of individual rights as amendments to the Constitution. They were introduced in the first Congress by then Representative James Madison and were ratified by the necessary 9 out of 13 states in 1791. Mason also wrote the first version of what is now the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which is the right of citizens to bear arms. So isn't it fascinating that George Mason, who's little known, drafted the Virginia Constitution with Madison and also drafted the Virginia Bill of Rights, or the Declaration of Rights. So that became the model for the U.S. Constitution. He also wrote the Second Amendment to the Constitution, and yet he didn't end up signing the Constitution at the convention because he felt very strongly that it needed to have a Bill of Rights before he would agree to it. So, of course, he got his way later on when Madison, as he had promised, went ahead and got those Bill of Rights approved in 1791. Number 8, James Madison employed a number of secret codes in the negotiations on the Constitution and the aftermath. Madison, like any good politician, was terrified of the idea that someone might intercept one of his private letters. Along with Jefferson and many mutual allies, Madison used complicated encryptions when relaying delicate info. Having now the use of my cipher, he informed Jefferson in 1784, after mastering a new system, now I can write without restraint. Some of Madison's most sensitive letters about the Constitution drafting, he used this system to encrypt during that time. It's really fascinating that almost as if they were worried about spies intercepting what they were talking about, they would encrypt these letters back and forth to each other. Number 9, weird facts about the Constitution. The delegates were involved in debates from 10 a.m. until 3 p.m., 6 days a week, with only a 10-day break during the duration of the entire convention. Another interesting fact, the word democracy does not appear once in the entire Constitution. Also, the Constitution has only been changed 17 times since 1791. So it's really, as we talked about, very difficult to amend the Constitution. There was a proposal at the Constitutional Convention to limit the standing army for the country to just 5,000 men. George Washington sarcastically agreed with the proposal as long as there was a stipulation added that no invading army could have more than 3,000 troops. So as you can imagine, this proposal failed. Vermont ratified the Constitution on January 10th, 1791, even though it had not yet become a state. So that's really interesting. They actually, even though they weren't a state yet, went ahead and ratified it anyway. You see a great picture there of George Washington presiding in his uniform over the Constitutional Convention. And then, of course, an excellent picture there of Madison as he was making his very stringent arguments to the convention themselves. Number 4, Ben Franklin was the grandfather of the nation. He was the oldest person to sign the Constitution at 81 years old. The youngest was Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey. Because of his poor health, Benjamin Franklin needed help to sign the Constitution. As he did so, tears streamed down his face. You can imagine this was incredibly emotional. This was the oldest of the founding fathers, and it must have meant so much to him to finally form this government. As Benjamin Franklin left Pennsylvania State House after the final meeting of the Constitutional Convention on September 17, 1787, he was approached by the wife of the mayor of Philadelphia. She was curious as to what the new government would be, and Franklin replied, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Franklin died on April 17th, 1790, at the age of 84. The 20,000 mourners at his funeral on April 21st, 1790, constituted the largest public gathering in the country up to that time. You can imagine how much beloved Franklin was as the grandfather of the nation. There's a great picture of him making his arguments to the Constitutional Convention, and then a picture of him with some of the other drafters working on drafts of the document. Number 11, Mason's low profile as founder, partly due to his no vote. So as I said a little bit earlier, and you see some pictures there of Mason on the right arguing to the Virginia legislature against the Constitution without a Bill of Rights. And then on the top left in his red coat at the Constitutional Convention. George Mason's refusal to sign the Constitution and participate in the new federal government put him on the loser's side of history, despite having very good reasons for his opposition and many contemporaries having similar issues with the Constitution. This seemed to taint Mason for future historians. What is ironic is Mason was heavily involved in every aspect of the drafting of the Constitution. So James Madison and George Washington were shocked when he decided to oppose it due to the lack of the Bill of Rights included in the document. Despite being sidelined in most history books, he still led a fascinating life and contributed greatly to our American identity. And he really is one of those lost founders. He really should get a lot more notoriety for what he did in the formation of our government. Number 12, many founders felt the Constitution was a miracle. John Adams referred to the Constitution as the greatest single effort of national deliberation that the world has ever seen. George Washington wrote to the Marquis de Lafayette that the Constitution, appears to me then little short of a miracle. James Madison of Virginia was responsible for proposing the resolution to create the various cabinet positions within the executive branch of our government, and 12 amendments to the Constitution, of which 10 became the Bill of Rights. You see some great pictures there of the framers as they were continuing to work on drafts together. I can't imagine what some of these conversations would like. I would love to be a fly on the wall. Number 13, convention delegates represented by many lawyers and patriots. And there's the famous picture, probably the most famous painting of this Constitutional Convention. You see Franklin sitting right in front, George Washington presiding, Madison leaning over, listening. Of the 55 delegates who attended the convention, 34 were lawyers, 8 had signed the Declaration of Independence, and almost half were Revolutionary War veterans. The remaining members were planters, educators, ministers, physicians, financiers, judges, and merchants. About a quarter of them were large landowners, and all of them held some type of public office. 39 were former congressmen, and 8 were present or past governors. Interesting fact, Alexander Hamilton called for the convention itself and organized it and sent all of the invitations. So although James Madison was the driver behind the document and really had the plan to create a new government and new constitution, it was Alexander Hamilton who both called for the convention and then organized it. Number 14, George Washington and James Madison were the only presidents who signed the Constitution. Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts was opposed to the office of the vice president. The close intimacy that must subsist between president and vice president makes it absolutely improper. However, he put his feelings aside and became vice president under James Madison later on, which is kind of ironic. 4 of the signers of the Constitution were born in Ireland, but the only other language used in various parts of the Constitution is Latin. A proclamation by George Washington and a congressional resolution established the first National Thanksgiving Day on November 26, 1789. The reason for the holiday was to give thanks to God and the new Constitution and not the Pilgrims. The current meeting of Thanksgiving did not come until 50 years later. It's really interesting that the first 50 Thanksgivings after 1789, as proclaimed by George Washington, were a thanks to God and also a thanks to the new Constitution. And you can see that proclamation there on the top right that was actually printed up in all the newspapers around the country by George Washington, one of his first official acts as president. Number 15, James Madison was the architect of the U.S. Constitution and the last surviving signer of the 39. James Madison considered his work on the U.S. Constitution, which created a new type of government, a brilliant experiment, as his greatest achievement. At the end of his life, for months, the dying ex-president remained bedridden, but he would still talk to his aides and his wife Dolly about the foundation of the country. On June 28, 1836, Madison found he couldn't swallow his breakfast. "What is the matter, Uncle James?" asked his beloved niece, Nellie Willis. "Nothing but a change of mind, my dear," he replied before he died. You see a great picture of him on the top left doing some of his arguments, and then another great picture there of him and his beloved U.S. Constitution. Number 16, compromise was the only way the Constitution got approved. You saw a little bit about this in the video. The Great Compromise saved the Constitutional Convention and probably the Union itself. Authored by Connecticut delegate Roger Sherman, and you see a picture of him on the top left there. It called for a proportional representation in the House and 1 representative per state in the Senate, which of course was then later changed to 2 senators per state. The compromise passed 5-4, with 1 state, Massachusetts, divided. This compromise was important because there was a battle happening between the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. When it was ratified in 1787, the Constitution enshrined the institution of slavery through the so-called 3/5 Compromise, which called for those bound to service for a term of years and all other persons to be counted for representation purposes as 3/5 of free people. The word slavery, however, never appeared in the Constitution until 1865 ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States. And you can see a picture at the top up there with the Virginia Plan on one side, New Jersey Plan on the other, and then the compromise in the middle, which became the Connecticut Plan by Roger Sherman, and the reason that the Constitution passed in the first place. Number 17, only 6 founders signed the Declaration and the Constitution. 6 men signed both Declaration of Independence and the Constitution: George Read, Roger Sherman, Benjamin Franklin, Robert Morris, George Clymer, and James Wilson. The Constitution does not require that the Speaker of the House of Representatives be a member of the House, although a non-member has never been chosen Speaker. But technically, it could happen. The 4 pages of the Constitution are on permanent display at the National Archives, as we showed you earlier. But there is a 5th page. It is a letter of transmittal of the newly written Constitution to Congress that existed under the Articles of Confederation. The letter, which briefly describes the Constitution, is signed by George Washington, President of the Constitutional Convention. It is dated September 17th, 1787, the anniversary of which we celebrate each day as Constitution Day. And you can see there a really good quote from George Washington: "The Constitution is the guide which I will never abandon." And you can see a great snapshot there of both pages of the letter that George Washington sent to that Congress of the Articles of Confederation to consider this new Constitution as the new form of government. Number 18, Madison was one of three authors of the Federalist Papers. Together with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay, James Madison authored the Federalist Papers. These 85 essays were printed in two New York newspapers as a way to argue for the Constitution, so the New York could agree to ratify it. One of the most famous of these papers was number 51, which Madison penned. It contained the famous quote, "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." You see a picture there of that particular article in the Federalist Papers. And as it says here, the first two newspapers that printed these regularly through that period really assisted get the word out. But many other papers in all the other 13 colonies picked up these articles and reprinted them in their states. And so the Federalist Papers, although targeting New York voters, really ended up becoming national documents that everybody looked at and understood what the overall arguments were for passage by the Federalist Party. Number 19, chair with the sun was setting or rising. During the Constitutional Convention, George Washington sat in a chair that had representation of half of a sun on top. You can see it there on the top left, which Benjamin Franklin regularly gazed at during troublesome and contentious moments of the proceedings. Asked why, he said he was unable to decide if the sun was rising or setting. Only when the Constitution was signed did Franklin decide the sun was rising. And so you can imagine them all sitting in this room 6 to 7 hours a day, 6 days a week for months and months and months. And so you sometimes would get to daydreaming. And so Benjamin Franklin would look at this chair, look at George Washington himself, and wonder if that sun was rising or setting. Number 20, what should we call our leader? One of the Constitutional Convention debates was the title of the nation's chief executive. One possible idea, His Highness the President of the United States of America and Protector of their Liberties. You talk about a really long title. Eventually, everyone settled on the President of the United States, according to Article 2, Section 1. While this section states that the Vice President inherits the powers and duties of the presidency, it does not state that he or she shall assume the office of the presidency himself. When President William Henry Harrison became the first president to die while in office in 1841, Vice President John Tyler began referring to himself as the president, and the convention stuck. However, this succession wasn't made official until 1967, when the 25th Amendment was actually ratified. So we spent all those hundreds of years with no real true cure to what happened if the president died in office. Pretty interesting. Number 21, against the Bill of Rights before he was for them. Madison was one of the main proponents of the passage of the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, known collectively as the Bill of Rights. These were ratified in 1791 as he proposed them to Congress. Ironically, he was against the Bill of Rights at first, thinking the state constitutions had it handled for individual rights. He was later convinced by other members of the Continental Congress that a Bill of Rights was necessary to bring the southern states into the fold. He then became a tireless proponent of the Bill of Rights and proposed them for passage in Congress. You see a picture of them on the bottom left there, the Bill of Rights being the first 10 amendments. And then a great quote there from Madison: "The purpose of the Constitution is to restrict the majority's ability to harm the minority." And that really is true. And that's something that, unfortunately, our society is starting to lose the understanding of. But really, minority rights are very important in the Constitution. Number 22, the Constitution was a sweaty, smelly affair. The Constitution was drafted in Philadelphia in 1787 over the course of a very humid summer. The windows of Independence Hall were shut to discourage eavesdroppers, and many delegates, who were mostly from out of town, wore and rewore the same thick woolen garments day after day and sweat out hour after hour of debates. Many framers stayed at the same boarding houses and shared rooms, and we can only imagine they reeked with a distinct ode to freedom. You can't even imagine what the smell must have been with these guys who would wear these really heavy clothes in the summer with no air conditioning and the windows closed. Must have been pretty interesting. Number 23, Benjamin Franklin had to be carried to the convention. At the time, 81-year-old Benjamin Franklin was in awful pain. He had gout and could barely stand. Instead of walking, he arrived at Independence Hall on at least the first couple of days, carried by 4 prisoners from the Walnut Street jail, who ferried him around the city in a sedan chair. You can see an artist rendering of it there on the right of these men that would carry Franklin around in this contraption. And there's a great picture of him considering some of the amendments. Number 24, constitutional amendments are difficult to pass on purpose. The amendment may be proposed by 2/3 of each House of Congress or by a national convention called by Congress in response to a request by 2/3 of the state legislatures. It becomes part of the Constitution after being ratified either by the legislatures of 3/4 of the states or by conventions in 3/4 of the states. Congress decides which form of ratification should be used and how much time the states have to consider each amendment. The process of amending the Constitution was designed to be difficult. And you can see all the constitutions laid out there to take a look at. And of course, the first one is freedom of speech, then right to bear arms, etc. So they had to go through a lot of work to get all of these amendments passed through this very difficult process. Number 25, the Constitution and Declaration of Independence occurred in the same hall. And we saw a picture 2 slides back of what Independence Hall looked like. The Constitution and Declaration of Independence were signed in the same Independence Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia was chosen because of its proximity to all 13 states and was the largest city in the country at that time with about 44,000 residents. The delegates were strictly ordered not to share any convention deliberations with the public. They had to keep all records of the event a secret for 30 years, and this was done to encourage the delegates to share their opinions without any fear. That being said, most people took notes during the convention, however, and the notes of James Madison were the most detailed. These were the only notes that gave us an in-depth description of what took place during the convention. You see a great picture there on the top right of the hundreds of pages of notes that Madison took during these 6 months. I would love to get a hold of these and really do a good read and see what he was talking about. There's a great book that's out now that actually reprints a lot of his notes. So you can look through them and take a look yourself and see what you think. Some famous quotes from the constitutional debates. First one there from Madison: the purpose of the Constitution is to restrict the majority's ability to harm the minority. We saw that quote a little bit earlier. Here's one from Jefferson: it is every American's right and obligation to read and interpret the Constitution for himself or herself. Thomas Jefferson. Another one from Jefferson: a Bill of Rights is what the people are entitled to against every government, and what no just government should refuse or rest on interference. So a lot of these anti-federalists were very strong in wanting the individual freedoms and rights to be codified. Here's one from George Washington: the basis of our political system is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government. One from Franklin: henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of this city be requested to officiate in the service. So this was, you can see, actually Benjamin Franklin was one of the least religious people of all the delegates, but he became more and more religious through this process because he was looking for some kind of divine intervention to help bridge some of the divides between the delegates. The Constitution only guarantees the American people the right to pursue happiness. You have to catch it yourself. Really great quote there. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited to it by the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Very strong about how the Constitutional Convention goers really felt was that everything should be enumerated in the Constitution if it was a federal power. And if it was not in there, then it was reserved to the states or to the people. Here's one by George Mason: to disarm the people is the most effectual way to enslave them. You can see he felt very strongly about the Second Amendment, of course. George Washington: the Constitution is the guide which I will never abandon. Here's one from James Wilson, who signed both Declaration and Constitution. Whoever would be obliged to obey a constitutional law is justified in refusing to obey an unconstitutional act of the legislature. When a question, even of this delicate nature, occurs, everyone who is called to act has the right to judge. And so, again, talking about strict constitutionalists, that's what these men were. If it was in there, you had to abide by it. If it was not in there, you didn't. Here's one by Lincoln many years later. We, the people, are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution. Really excellent quotes there across the board by all these founders and great leaders in our history about this very important and most important document. So I hope you enjoyed that and learned a lot about the U.S. Constitution. There's a lot to know. There were so many things happening in the years leading up to it, after the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, some of the challenges the new country was facing, a weak federal government that was unable to tax, was unable to keep a standing army. The post office was failing. There were a lot of problems with it. And this U.S. Constitution coming in to give it some more powers and more ability to actually organize and do its business while still preserving liberties for the people and for the states. It was a great compromise, the Connecticut Compromise, and really set us on a path of success as a country the last 250 years. I recommend that you actually read the Constitution sometime from front to back. It's really not that long a read, and it is incredibly important. It is the supreme law of the land, and it's something we live under every single day, and every one of our officers swears to uphold. And every one of our officers swears to uphold. So again, it's very important. And the history of it is just as important, to see how it came about, why some of the compromises in it were made so that it could actually be pushed forward and signed and adopted and ratified. And there's so much to know about American history, but this is one of the big ones. So I recommend you also take a look at our episode on the Declaration of Independence. That's a really good one. And then sometime in the future, we're going to do one on the Bill of Rights themselves and talk about each of the individual Bill of Rights and how they were crafted and why they were crafted the way they were. So hopefully you'll like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of great content coming your way. And I hope that you love history as much as we do. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much.